So our next guest is Kevin Hazzard. And Kevin uh, is an author. He's a journalist. He also is a former paramedic. But, and Kevin is not an African American, but the book that he wrote is called American Sirens, and it's about the first Black paramedics in the United States in Pittsburgh. And they were also, well, they were the first ones in Pittsburgh, but also the first ones in the United States. They kind of created the whole paramedic industry, or I guess that's what you would call it. But he wrote a book about it. And so we wanted to have him on to talk about his book and what motivated him to write the book and the research that he did. So, Kevin, welcome to Black Authors Matter TV.
Thanks for having me on.
And you're a journalist as well as a former paramedic. So, did the journalism come first or the medicine?
The journalism came first for me, and then 9/11 happened, and I was kind of young working in a newspaper, and I was like, all right, I think I should be doing more than I am. And I wasn't sure what that would look like. And then one night I got called out to cover a tunnel collapse, and it was a really horrific event. And I looked at the people who showed up to help, and I thought, all right, that's something I can do. And it just became my life for a decade.
Wow. So that one moment just kind of changed the way you viewed things, or was it that you saw just everybody coming together? What was it about it? Just because everybody helped?
Yeah, so it was this Northwest Atlanta. They were doing this massive wastewater treatment project, and they had this enormous hole, hundreds of yards wide, hundreds of yards deep. They were a group of men down on the scaffolding, and it just gave way underneath them, and they disappeared into the earth. And so we got there. I was a newspaper journalist. I got there shortly before the family did. And so we were standing there covering what had happened and trying to figure out what was going to happen next. And, very quickly, what we all realized was a body recovery became very personal, because there were a dozen women who were waiting to see if their husbands were going to come out. And so, what do you say to somebody in a moment like that? How do you interact with someone and, who's trying to wrap their head around this sort of unfolding tragedy, which, while you assume, also holding on to a glimmer of hope. And while that was happening, the city's high-angle technical rescue team came, and they were the ones who lowered themselves down to pull these bodies out. And, the sort of 23-year-old in me responded to the way these guys carried themselves, a certain confidence. But the human in me responded to the way that they dealt with the families. They were, nobody else wanted to say anything. But of course, these guys were on the other side of that bridge. They were sort of in it together, and they were able to communicate with these people. And that was something that just clicked with me, this idea of these two people being able to make this connection across a tremendous divide in the midst of a horrible tragedy. And I thought it just felt like a worthwhile thing as soon as I saw it, and seemed kind of what I've been searching for.
Wow. So first of all, that's a beautiful story, and it's very inspirational. But I guess now I wonder, what made you decide that you wanted to write about the history of EMTs, and then even further, what made you look into Black EMTs?
I wrote, after having worked for 10 years on an ambulance, I wrote a memoir about sort of the crazy, funny, scary, wild life that is, a career on an ambulance. And after it came out, somebody who read it sent me this email and said, hey, have you ever heard of Freedom House? And I had not. And so I started looking into it. And two things struck me. First was, working on an ambulance was this, it was this really formative decade of my life. It's something I take very personally. I have a strong connection to the medical community, the emergency community, first responder community from that time. And so when I saw that there was this incredible origin story to EMS that had never been told, that I had never been told, that nobody I knew had been told, I kind of don't know, it frustrated me because I thought, here's this incredibly worthwhile career that these people do. And the way it all began, the people who started it have been lost to history. And I thought, I was already a writer. I'd already been a journalist, and it just felt like the perfect story for me to get into. And then, of course, the more I began to dig into it, the more I realized that at every turn, each person that I came across was more fascinating than the last, and the story just kept ratcheting itself up, and the tension and the stakes kept getting higher. And suddenly you realize that it's an incredible story. And then when I started reaching out to people, wasn't sure what kind of reaction I was going to get. These were men in their 70s, who they had been waiting decades, since before I was born, for someone to tell their story. So I didn't know how frustrated they were going to be. I didn't know how open they would be. People have a tendency to promise a lot when you have a very exciting story. And I figured that these guys were probably snake bit. And what I found was this incredibly gracious group of people who were humble, but also incredibly proud. And all they wanted was an opportunity for the world to know what they'd done. Early on in my research, I spoke with a widow, and she said, my husband died without my children knowing what he did. And I just want someone to tell the story. And you can't have a conversation like that and walk away. That you have no choice but to kind of dig in as just as a human. You just think, my God, like, this is a story that deserves to be told.
Right. So the title of your book is American Sirens, but the subhead, and I had that right here. Oh, here it is. The incredible story of the Black men who became America's first paramedics. So people don't, it's sort of a niche within a niche within a niche. People don't really think that they hear more about doctors, they're in hospitals, or even nurses. And we have some more information about nurses historically, that have served in the wars, World War II, World War I. But we hadn't really heard anything about this whole topic of paramedics. And it's amazing that you took it upon yourself to bring it to life. Now, how did you, in your research, do you have a copy of your book so you can show the cover to people?
I do.
I'm upset with you that you had to look for it, though.
Okay, yeah, American Sirens. So who's the person on the cover?
A gentleman by the name of Walt Brown, who was sort of, if Peter Safar was the intellectual fountainhead from which the idea sprang, Walt Brown was he was the personality, and he was the guy who represented the people who were doing the work. Walt was, this huge personality that everybody kind of fell in line with. We all know that kind of person who just sort of, is a natural leader, and he was that kind of guy. But he also, was able to, touch very personally people of all different ages. Some of these guys were incredibly young. Some of these guys were, in their 60s. And, he was able to sort of coalesce this group into this incredibly effective force. And, unfortunately, he died before I got onto the story. But everybody I talked to, the one thing you would hear over and over again is, it's a shame he didn't talk to Walt. It's a shame he didn't talk to Walt. Because he was really the heart behind the operation. So he was the one who wound up in the cover.
I think that's great that all these people held him up to such high regard, and then you put him on the cover. I'm sure that meant a lot to the people you talked with.
I hope so. I mean, that was certainly the intention.
So how did they get started being paramedics when they didn't exist before?
And that's what's part of what's so incredible about this story. So there are two things that happen at once. One is that in 1965, a small, sort of forgotten little organization within the U.S. government puts up this pamphlet that's since been known as the white paper that said that paramedics were, or the word paramedic didn't exist, but we'll just use it. Yeah, paramedics were too few to be there when you needed them, and too unskilled to be of much use when they did get there. And it was such a huge problem that in 1965 alone, more Americans were killed in highway traffic accidents than had died in the entire Korean War. And at the same time, you're more likely to survive a gunshot wound in Vietnam than you are in the US. And the reason for both of those things is that there's no pre-hospital care. So nobody knows what to do about that. So that's kind of where we are in 1965, is that if you have a medical emergency, the people who show up at your door in all likelihood are going to be two undertakers and a hearse, because it's the only business capable of carrying a body. So if you have an emergency, imagine you are hoping not to die and you look out your window and this hearse screeches up with flower petals trailing from the last funeral. I mean, it feels like the worst way to begin this like life-saving moment, but that was the reality. And so there's a doctor, Peter Saffer. He was this Austrian-born anesthesiologist who had invented just a decade before CPR. Prior to that, the method that we had was this really archaic mechanical method of trying to manipulate the body. And Saffer undertook a series of studies to prove that exhaled oxygen could keep people alive. So he introduces mouth to mouth and he pairs that with chest compressions. He releases the results of his study, and sort of instantly, the world has CPR, and he travels all over the place to teach it. So then from there, he invents the modern ICU. He invents critical care. He's a pioneer in the world of anesthesiology, which was just beginning. So this is the sort of person he is. He's living in Pittsburgh in the early 1960s, and he had a daughter who was a severe asthmatic who died one evening while he and his wife were out of town. She went into a bad asthma attack. Help was called, and in the time that she was picked up by the first responders until the time she got to the hospital, she was not breathing, and so was brain dead. So even though when they got to the hospital, Saffer himself took over her care, got a heart rate back on her, got her breathing again, but was unable to save her because she was brain dead. So he now has this very personal reason to want to fix this problem that the nation faces in 1965. And so he develops what we would today recognize as a paramedic training program. It's as rigorous as anything people take today. He modeled it after medical school. So he understood that if you wanted to create a new profession, you needed to create a new professional. So he designed a program that laymen could walk into, people with zero medical experience or training whatsoever. They could take this course and come out on the other side of it and be ready. So it was going to be a very intense 9-month course in which they would learn heart attacks and strokes and how to stop bleeding, overdoses, deliver babies, respiratory emergencies, seizures, give narcotics, all this stuff. And then when they were done, they would go through the OR, the ER, ICU, OB, all these things to sort of see and put their hands on all this knowledge and then go out in the street and do it. So he has this wonderful idea, but can you imagine somebody saying to you, hey, put your life on hold for this incredibly intense 9-month course that you might fail out of, in which, by the way, when it's over with, you might not have a job because this thing technically doesn't exist. Like you aren't going to get people to walk away from their job to do that. So you've got to, who are you going to find? So he can't find anybody. So you have on one side of Pittsburgh, Peter Saffer, who has this great idea, but no people to carry it out. And on the other side of Pittsburgh, you have a man by the name of James McCoy, who was a civil rights activist who'd grown frustrated with what he considered to be a slow-moving older generation of civil rights activists. And he struck out on his own, created this organization called Freedom House. And the idea for Freedom House was to generate job opportunities and like job training programs for people who are living in the Hill District, which was a predominantly Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And he just couldn't find anything that he was looking for. He didn't want to train gardeners and housekeepers. He wanted a sort of career that was going to bring people to another level of society. And, not terribly surprisingly, he was having a very difficult time finding that sort of a job training program for, Black people living in the Hill, which at that time, like a lot of America, once thriving neighborhood had been sucker punched by urban renewal. And so huge swaths of neighborhood were torn down. A civic center was put in, a highway was put in. And so, job opportunities go away, hope goes away, crime goes up, poverty goes up. So by the mid 1960s, the Hill was in a very bad spot. And he was trying to find a way to, to help people in his community. So he has a group of people who can't find a great job. And then over here, you've got Peter Saffer, who's got this great job, but he can't find people. And through this sort of wonderful bit of kismet, they meet, and you know, Saffer pitches McCoy on the idea of, like, you know, that he's going to, you know, create this quantum leap in medicine and have this whole new branch of emergency medicine, that it's going to include these paramedics and go through this training program. And he wants McCoy to recruit and staff the program. And McCoy says, fine, I'll happily do that. But everybody who goes through this training program has to be from the Hill. They have to be Black. And Peter Saffer, he was a white guy. He was Austrian. He didn't have any connection to the American Civil Rights Movement, but he had witnessed the Holocaust at a close remove. He was in Vienna when the Nazis came across the border. His mother was part Jewish. You know, his mom lost her job as a doctor. His father lost his job as a doctor. So he had seen, you know, what hate and violence can bring. And so, you know, he very quickly said, yeah, okay, let's do this. And so in that meeting, two ideas are born. One is that the world's first paramedics will be from the city of Pittsburgh, and two, that there'll be 24 Black men from the Hill District.
That is amazing.
That is.
It's
amazing. One thing is amazing that you can recite all of that.
Yeah,
I've been with this since.
I was actually going to say that too, because I'm listening to you and you're telling this story like you were there and knew all of these people.
Right.
I've been living this since 2018.
Oh, okay. So now they go through this program, this 9-month program, and then they graduate, and then they 1965 was still, segregation was still the rule of thumb.
Right.
So were they only able to be paramedics in the Black community, or were they allowed to go throughout the city?
So, well, a couple of things. The city approves the funding in 66. They wind their way through this training program in 67. They emerge in the spring of 68. He's the very first guys to do this. And they had thought that it was going to be this sort of quiet time in which they'd be able to sort of creep out and roll this thing out slowly. And they come out of the classroom at like April 3rd, 1968, thinking that, you know, quiet days are ahead. And of course, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, and cities across America immediately erupt into violence. And so they're conscripted into duty immediately because police and firefighters are unable to make it into the Hill District. And of course, there are, aside from any injuries that have, you know, come up from the violence, they're just ordinary people with health emergencies. And so that's when they begin their first running their first calls. The program was initially only supposed to be in the Hill District in a neighborhood called Oakland, which was where the Pittsburgh University Medical Center was, which is where their doctors were located. And their idea from the beginning was, hey, what we'll do is we'll prove ourselves locally. We will treat our own community. And then once we show that this thing is a viable form of medicine, because again, remember, nobody's performing medicine outside the hospital. Nobody other than a doctor. These guys are technically doing things that a nurse is not allowed to do. And, you know, nursing, you know, as you said before, is this long and storied profession. Here's this brand new thing that is theoretically deputizing non-medical personnel to do things that only doctors can do. So they needed to prove it could work and that it was safe and that it was effective. And so they start small, but they assumed that, oh, well, once people see this, you know, common sense will rule out and they will just spread this thing out across the city and everybody will be happy. So initially they start out in their community. It is an immediate success. They do a study of critical patients coming into the hospitals. And what they find is that in critical patients where someone's life is on the line, the fire department and the police department do the wrong thing about 80% of the time. Freedom House, with lives on the line, do the right thing 80% of the time. So it's unequivocally a success. And so then, you know, because Saffer's famous and because this is this new innovation, other doctors and communities begin coming in to look what's going on. They're borrowing pieces of it, bringing it out. It is starting to trickle around the country. It is slowly percolating and becoming, you know, a more used and accepted form of medicine. And they branch out to downtown. For the first time, you have Freedom House paramedics responding to calls with white patients. Pittsburgh, it's a northern city. I had assumed that, it wouldn't be, that it wasn't Mississippi, I guess. And
Right.
what, but it has a really, Pittsburgh has a very interesting history. In the 1950s, the city filled in its public swimming pool as opposed to integrate it. You know, the reason that James McCoy was able to start Freedom House is because he had spent so much time trying to get utilities and breweries and construction sites to hire Black employees. And at that same time, you had the housing covenants were just beginning to be lifted. So for the first time, a Black family could move into any neighborhood that it wanted in any of the Pittsburgh suburbs. And the white residents found this to be so distasteful and odious that if you and I lived next to each other and I didn't like you, I would intentionally sell my house to a Black family just to spite you. It was covered in the newspaper, it's referred to as spite selling. So if you come from a place where the idea of living next to a Black family is so horrible that you would intentionally do it to get back at a neighbor you dislike, imagine you're having a heart attack and you call for help and you're sitting there and you're desperate and you're scared and you hear the sound of help walking down the hallway and help rounds the corner and you see that it's arrived in the form of two young Black men from a neighborhood that you're probably scared of. Everywhere that they went downtown, they ran into problems. They had women who said, no, you're not going to lay your hands on me. They had men that said, no, you're not going to touch me. We're going to wait and we're going to call for somebody else. And John Moon is a guy that I talked to a lot for this story. And I said to him, I said, what do you say to somebody? He said, well, let's say someone's having a heart attack. I would sit down to explain what was going on with them. I would explain what I would do for them. And then also what the delay in treatment could do. And I said, what would they do? And he said, well, they'd think about it and then they'd say yes. But the fact that you have to think about possibly death versus allowing Black hands to touch me, it says something about the psychology of the people, and it was something that they had to deal with regularly, but to their unending credit, they did it with incredible grace. The Freedom House is covered pretty regularly in the newspapers, and they were very disliked in powerful corners. Had they acted out in any kind of way, had they done anything that was untoward in any sort of way, it would have been covered widely. There's no report at any point of two Freedom House medics acting like human beings and just getting angry about the way they were treated. They just refused to do that, and they call after call, regardless of what people did, they did the right thing, which is really a tremendous testament to the character of a lot of these, and a lot of them are really young guys with very little world experience. This was kind of the first time they were being exposed to the world.
As you're telling this story, it reminds me of an episode of The Jeffersons when George and Tom had gone to a kind of an EMT course to learn how to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation.
Mm-hmm.
And it just so happened that some of the men who were in the class were Klansmen. And when they found out they were Klansmen, there was a big clash. And then one of the Klansmen had a heart attack, and George saved them by doing mouth-to-mouth.
Yeah.
And then when the Klansman's son said, Mr. Jefferson saved your life, he said, that Black man put his mouth on me, son, you should have let me die.
Yeah.
And so I'm picturing that there were probably some people who felt that way, who would rather have died than to have let these men from this scary neighborhood touch them or treat them. And I just wonder if they went through that. And so I'm glad to know that I think a lot of these young men probably expected that treatment. And so it maybe helped them to be able to do their jobs with honor, and because they already knew it was going to happen, it wasn't a shock to them. So that's
Well,
just
that was why I asked the question about the
Mhm.
time period when he said 1965, because there were some things that were understood during that time period.
right.
And Black people understood they had to be submissive, regardless of how they were being treated. It was just that was the way it was. And just because it was a northern city. some of the worst race situations occurred in northern cities like Boston and Chicago. So they were some of them were worse than what happened in the South. So
Yeah.
now you mentioned the Jeffersons. I'm going to mention two movies that came to my mind. You know, while he was talking, it was coming to my mind. One is Raisin in the Sun, the original Raisin in the Sun with Sidney Poitier, where they bought a home in a white neighborhood, and
Yes.
the homeowners association or whatever, the man came over to buy the house back just so they wouldn't move in. And then, you know, this other movie has Sidney Poitier too, but it's even older, called No Way Out. I don't know if you've ever seen No Way Out. Sidney Poitier is a doctor. He's like just become a doctor. It's the late 1950s, and Richard Whitmark, I think is the actor, is a very racist person. He's also a criminal, and he comes into the hospital and he needs a doctor. And Sidney Poitier is trying to help him, and he refuses to let him touch him or his brother, and the brother dies. So during that time, that was very common. It seems like a world away now, but during those times, it was very, Black people were in a particular position, and that's where we were. Our ancestors were. And we really,
I am glad that he told this story
yes,
because I've never thought of the history of Black EMTs or Black paramedics, and it never crossed my mind. And so this is a whole group of people whose stories would have never gotten told had he not made that phone call. And then some guy's like, "What? You want to tell my story?"
yeah, and then you kept at it, and you learned a lot while you were reporting and just doing the research for the book. I want to
Yeah.
tell you how I heard about the book.
All right.
I have a very good customer. We used to have a brick and mortar, but we have a customer that's been buying books from us for 20 years, even though we no longer have a brick and mortar, but we can still order books. And she listens to NPR like every day, all day, about new books that have come out. And she said, you need to get Keith Hazzard on your show. And so that was how, then I researched the book, and and then I reached out to you. That was how I learned about it.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, it really is an incredible story. And, you know, like I said before, these are people who did a job, you know, who answered a call for help decades ago. And I've been waiting since before I was born for just someone to say thank you. When the city took over EMS world citywide in Pittsburgh, their medical director set out these list of demands, I guess you could say, 6 things that she wanted the city to do in recognition of Freedom House. And some of it was, you know, allowing them, you know, when they transferred over to the city, to operate at the current level and not have to go through any other training, and to keep partnerships together. And you know, if somebody worked in a certain neighborhood, let them stay in that neighborhood because that's what they're familiar with. And so she sent this letter to the mayor. And so I have the letter she sent to the mayor, and I have the mayor's response. And he says, okay, you know, he agrees to, you know, we'll take over service at, you know, at midnight on, you know, in October. And here's all these things we're going to do. And of her 6 demands, 5 of them he lists out, you know, we're 100% we'll do this, 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 and this. And the 6th demand was that the city of Pittsburgh will publicly thank thank Freedom House for the service that it's provided for the last 8 years. And that was the only demand that they refused. The one that was free, the one that would have been easiest for them to do, was the one they refused. And so that demand is not on the mayor's response. And, you know, the city never did anything formal or official to thank Freedom House. And I think for them, you know, it was incredibly frustrating to have done this thing, and then for have it to be swept under the rug. But, you know, this wonderful postscript is that, you know, John Moon, one of the original paramedics, stayed with the city of Pittsburgh his entire career, retired as a chief. And in the mid-90s, he hired a young EMT by the name of Amara Gilchrist. And she stuck with the city and rose up through the ranks. And just this past spring, she became not only the first woman but also the first Black person to be the chief of Pittsburgh EMS. And that was someone that John not only hired, but mentored throughout her entire career. And so, there's this wonderful legacy to what, these guys helped bring into the world. Not only did they bring EMS to people like me, who, they created the job that I did. And not only did they, create this field that has changed the way lives are saved around the world, but locally on a very personal level, they were the bridge to bringing in a person like Amara Gilchrist to run the department.
Wow. Well, we could talk to you longer, but unfortunately, we've come to the end of the interview. But I do want to remind people, I believe your book will be released on the 15th of this month.
Paperback comes out. Yep, the book's out now. Paperback comes out in a couple of days. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere you get your books.
I want to ask one final question. We have several people. Please post the book and the author. So Rhonda, if you could do that.
I've already posted his
Okay.
website in the chat, but I can post it again.
Okay, but it sounds like this whole thing would make a great movie. Have you sold the movie rights?
We're working on it. We're working on it now. So
okay, it just sounds like a wonderful movie, and it's something that hasn't been told. So many of the movies are the same story over and over. This is totally different.
Different story. Yeah, I've had a lot of these guys reach out to me and say, I think Denzel's son would be perfect to play a young version of me. So I'm like, all right, hey, hopefully. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on Black Authors Matter TV, and congratulations on your book. And thank you for bringing this forgotten history to light.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate a chance to talk about it.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great evening.
Best wishes.
Happy New Year.
Same to you. Same to you.